In February of 2015, a golden retriever returned from the woods alone. Dirty, emaciated, with a healed old wound on his paw, he appeared at the door of a motel near El Portal and began scratching the metal threshold as if trying to call someone by name. The motel employee immediately recognized the dog from the wanted posters. His name was Cooper, and he belonged to 42-year-old Darcy Joseph and her 23-year-old son, Zach, who had disappeared in Yosemite National Park the previous June. There was no trace of them. And now, 8 months later, only a dog emerged from the mountains. He was alive, but he came back alone. And it was from that moment that the investigation, which had long been considered hopeless, received a new, eerie continuation. On June 23, 2014, in the cool pre-dawn hours, 42-year-old Darcy Joseph and her 23-year-old son Zach left their two-story home in Fresno. According to a neighbor who was out getting the paper at the time, they looked focused and yet elated. A trip to Yosemite National Park was a tradition they had maintained since Zach was a child. Their golden retriever, Cooper, was hanging around the trunk, whining and pawing at the gravel as if afraid of being left behind. They had chosen the Deer Camp Trail route in advance. It was a trail stretching deep into the coniferous forest east of Yosemite Valley. The place is not very well known among tourists, but it is safe enough for those who have experience in one-day and two-day hikes. The journal at the information stand always had only a few signatures, mostly from locals, rarely from out-of-town travelers. This made the route exactly what Darcy wanted: quiet, without noisy crowds, and with a minimum number of people on the way. The family began preparations 2 days in advance. Zach, according to his friend from college, bought a new camping knife and replaced the straps on his old backpack, which he recalled the same friend calling immortal. Darcy looked at the weather forecasts, printed out a map of the area, and left a copy on the kitchen table for her husband. The plan was simple: 1 day of climbing, a night in a tent near the upper beam, and the next day, a return trip down the same trail. They had to be home by Sunday evening. Cameras at the Sierra Fuel Stop gas station captured several short videos. A Ford Explorer pulls up to the pump. Zach gets out first, holding a water bottle. The next shot shows Darcy taking out her wallet. She is talking to the cashier, and according to the same cashier, the conversation was about the weather. The woman asked if there were any thunderstorms forecast for the area of the Highway 41. On the way out, they hugged briefly, like people who know they have a great weekend ahead of them. They arrived at the Deer Camp Trail parking lot between 11 and 12 o'clock. This was confirmed by the recordings from the registration camera at the entrance to the park. In the image, Darcy's SUV comes around a bend, stops for a few seconds in front of a barrier, and continues on down a serpentine road. At that stage, there was nothing to indicate that they were taking the last steps of their normal lives. When they did not return home on Sunday night, Michael Joseph made several dozen calls. According to his words recorded in the police report, at first he thought they might have simply lost contact. But when 9 p.m. rolled around, he called the park's hotline. The rangers sprang into action at dawn on Monday, checking the Deer Camp Trail parking lot first. The SUV was parked exactly where it was supposed to be, undamaged, locked, and with an almost empty trunk. There were no sleeping bags, backpacks, or food inside. Everything they had taken with them for 2 days in the woods, they took with them to the trail. The search teams set off along the main route and 2 auxiliary beams. On the first day, 3 search dogs worked. According to the dog handler's report, the trail was clear in the first 100 yards, but rapidly disappeared as soon as the ground became rocky. This is a typical problem on the Deer Camp Trail. Sections of middle ground give way to dry terraces where the trail doesn't hold at all. Then there is a dense interweaving of juniper, manzanita, and pine litter, where it is difficult to find even a fresh trail. By Monday evening, the groups had walked several miles along the main trail and side branches. They found nothing: no scraps of clothing, no torn food packaging, no signs of a struggle. The rangers noted in their report an important detail. Despite the dense forest, there are two areas in the area where hikers usually leave their first tracks, traces of a rest stop. But there was no sign of Darcy and Zach's campsite, not a handful of ashes, no signs of sitting on the ground, no crushed grass. On Tuesday, a helicopter was brought in. The pilot patrolled along the upper ridge, shooting video for further analysis. The footage shows only a thick cover of pine needles and gray stripes of stone outcroppings. Rescuers repeatedly reviewed the footage, but there was no color resembling clothing or the shimmering glow of metal objects. On Wednesday, volunteers from local clubs joined the search. According to their report, the weather was stable and visibility was good. They searched areas where tourists rarely go, small landslides, old stream beds, narrow depressions between rocks. But still, not a single clue. Darcy and Zach had left no trace. One of the important documents from that day was a report on the river drainage inspection. California's national parks have a strict protocol. When people go missing, they have to inspect the riverbeds in case of falls and subsequent water washouts. But this time, even there, nothing was found. Not a single backpack, not a single piece of cloth, not a single water bottle. On Friday, the fourth day of the active operation, the rangers concluded that Darcy and Zach had left the main route too early. The sheriff's report stated, "If they have gone to the east side of the gulch, the search is much more difficult. It is an area without clear trails and with many old landslides. It is in those landslides that even experienced hikers often fall into the trails." The search operation lasted more than a week. In total, several dozen miles of the park were combed, and visitors who had been in the region from June 23rd to June 25th were interviewed. None of them saw either Darcy or Zach after refueling. No one heard any screams or noticed anything suspicious. The rangers at the two remote campsites also did not register anything. The final report of the Ranger Service, which was dated July 3rd, 2014, contained the phrase, "They probably left the marked trail before anyone could see them." This dry official formula captured nothing of what Michael and the Darcy family felt, but it was the beginning of a long story that would grow with more questions with each passing day. Two people had disappeared on a well-marked route, without witnesses, without traces, without a single clue that would allow us to understand where exactly their journey ended. The forest was silent, and it seemed that it would keep this silence for a very long time. The active phase of the search lasted almost 3 weeks, as recorded in the official reports of the Yosemite Ranger Service, dated the end of July 2014. Every day began at dawn. Rangers, dog handlers, volunteers, and sometimes rescuers from other counties gathered at the base in the valley. Each of them had a copy of the map of the Deer Camp Trail area with the sectors that had already been combed. The search area grew every day, but the documents said the same thing. No results found. In the first week, they were looking for the consequences of an accident. All the most likely scenarios were checked. If Darcy or Zach could have fallen from a height, the rescuers examined every ledge, every cornice, every cliff that even slightly corresponded to a possible place of fall. Nothing. If they could have suffered from hypothermia, they also checked this, although the temperature did not drop to critical levels on those June days. Wildlife behaviorists examined the area in case of a bear or cougar attack. Such incidents were rare, but they could not be ruled out. However, no signs of struggle, fur, blood, or characteristic damage to the vegetation were found. The rangers' documents record several control walks of places where animals could have left a trail. All of these reports have the same conclusion: no signs of victims. For the official version, it was a dead end. The forest gave no clues, as if the two people had simply ceased to exist on its territory. During the second week of the search, they checked the version of the crime. It was the least desirable and most difficult version for the family, but it could not be ignored. Rangers and sheriff's officers checked remote parking lots, illegal campsites, temporary shelters, fallen trees, where traces of the crime could be hidden. They examined abandoned logging roads and side trails unknown to outsiders. And even there, everything was clean. Not a single fragment of fabric, not a single torn belt loop, not a single broken plastic carabiner that travelers so often lose. It was during this period that the reverse trail methodology was first used. This is when searchers move backwards from the starting point, not forwards, from the most remote areas through natural barriers, returning to the parking lot. The goal is to find evidence that the missing people could have changed their route immediately after starting the hike. This strategy has already saved operations in other national parks on numerous occasions. But this time, the reverse track was also fruitless. Technical checks were conducted in parallel with the search. Darcy and Zach's financial accounts showed no signs of activity. 0 transactions were recorded since they entered the park. Cell phone records were also unclear, with neither of their phones being active after noon on the day they arrived. This was typical in an area with virtually no coverage, but it also meant that their devices did not appear on any nearby towers over the next few days. After 2 weeks of failure, the Josephs turned to a San Francisco private investigator, Victor Grant. Grant's name is listed in the official records as an independent consultant, but his work was much more than just a simple consultation. He came to the park in person, interviewed everyone who could be found among the tourists who had been in the region between June 23rd and 26th. The interviews were conducted in hotels, campsites, small roadside motels, and shops near Route 41. According to the manager of the hotel in El Portal, the detective came every day and asked the same questions every time. Had anyone seen 2 similar people with a dog? Had anyone heard of atypical activity in the forest? Had anyone entered the establishment with wet clothes or scratched hands? All the answers were negative. The Grant also checked the archives for hermits or questionable individuals who might have lived in the vicinity of the park. The report on this check contained several pages of lists: former loggers, people without permanent housing, owners of old hunting huts. But none of them matched the descriptions, dates, habits, or physical characteristics of the person who might have made contact with Darcy and Zach in the Deer Camp Trail area. One of the questions the investigators asked almost every witness was about sounds. Did anyone hear screams? Were there impacts? Or did they hear the movement of a large animal? All the testimonies pointed to silence. Only one hiker from Utah reported hearing a distant sound like a rock falling. But this description was not confirmed. The forest was too dry in those days, and rock slides often move under their own weight, a common natural phenomenon. Time was working against the investigation. By the 3rd week, it became obvious that if the pair had gotten to a place where they couldn't be found using traditional methods, the chances of establishing a route were getting smaller. Pollen, dust, shoe prints, all of these disappear from the ground after a few days, sometimes even faster if the ground is dry. The search network became more and more like a meaningless repetition of the past. The same places were checked several times. Grant noted in his report that he felt Darcy and Zach were in an area that had no logical exit routes. The forest seems to have swallowed them up suddenly, he wrote at the end of one of his notes. By the end of the 3rd week, a new stamp appears in the Rangers' official documents. Operational search suspended until new information becomes available. This is a standard wording for cases where there are no clues, no witnesses, no objective data, no material traces. Formally, the investigation was not terminated, but it was exhausted. Normal tourist life resumed in Yosemite Valley, but the 2 people were never found. The family left the park with the feeling that the forest had taken them without explanation, and no one could say why it had done so with such eerie silence. On February 19, 2015, on a gloomy, rainy morning, when the tourist season had not yet begun, the owner of the small Yosemite View Motel, Dennis Farrell, heard a dull scraping sound at the metal door of the service entrance. He said in a Park Service report that he first thought it was a raccoon looking for scraps, but when he opened the door, he saw a wet golden retriever standing there, shivering and looking right at him. The dog's fur was stuck together from the rain and mud, a torn piece of leash hung on his side, and an old healed wound was visible on his right paw, looking like a place where a stitch might have been put in. Dennis recognized him immediately. He knew this dog's face better than many of the guests from the wanted posters that had been hanging in his motel for almost a year. Cooper is the dog of Darcy and Zach Joseph, who went missing on the Deer Camp Trail. According to Dennis's statement in the report, he had never seen a dog that looked so exhausted and yet so stubborn in wanting to find someone. He called the Park Service and Michael Joseph, whose number was listed on the postcards. While waiting for the rangers, Dennis put a bowl of water and some food in front of Cooper. The dog ate slowly, as if after a long fast. But according to the vet who examined him a few hours later, Cooper had not been hungry in recent days or weeks. On the contrary, they found remnants of store-bought food in his stomach, not wild food. This meant only one thing: he had recently been fed by a human. This fact provoked a new wave of speculation. If Cooper had returned, he might have been near Darcy and Zach. Maybe they were alive too. Maybe someone had taken them in. Or, according to a more disturbing version, they could have been held by the person who fed the dog. This option was not officially voiced, but in the internal documents of the rescue service, it was mentioned as a third-party hypothesis. A veterinary examination showed that Cooper had spent many months in the wilderness. His fur had bite marks from small insects, scratches from branches, and rubbing on his chest from wearing a collar for a long time. At the same time, his claws were not completely ground down, which indicated that he had been walking much less in recent weeks than before. This strange combination, a long journey with a sharp period of rest at the end, became a key element of the new stage of the search. The rangers, having received the dog, immediately organized a new search sector, focusing on the area between the motel and the western edge of the park. This area had not been searched before because it was believed to have no access from the Deer Camp Trail. But now, Cooper has shown that this possibility exists. The search focused on several inconspicuous old service roads overgrown with brush that had not been used for a long time. A dog handler was brought in to try to lead Cooper back into the forest in the hope that the dog could show the route he had taken. In the report, the dog handler noted, "Cooper's behavior is erratic. He starts moving, but after a few hundred feet, he loses his bearings or suddenly turns back." The dog was excited, but not focused. This is often the behavior of an animal returning from a stressful area or after being confined for a long time. The rangers checked areas along the Merced River, small side gullies, and places where traces of illegal camping had been found in the past. In some areas, the soil was so soft that even old shoe prints could be seen, but nothing consistent with Darcy or Zach was found. Several old service station buildings that had been decommissioned years ago were also examined. According to reports, they were empty, and traces of people's presence dated back at least a few years earlier. Searchers also analyzed the route Cooper could have theoretically taken. These days, he was weak, but not injured. This meant that the dog did not follow a continuous messy path through the thicket, but rather used some kind of road or trail that humans had created earlier. However, among the numerous overgrown service routes that had been laid out in the 90s, none of them showed any traces that would indicate fresh human movements. All hopes were pinned on Cooper reacting to a certain scent: Darcy's belongings brought from home or the footprints of other people in the forest. But according to the dog handler, the dog reacted too emotionally and chaotically, making his behavior unreliable for guidance. It was more like a creature running away from something than a guide leading to something. The press picked up the story. Newspapers across California ran headlines about the dog who came back by himself. This attracted the attention of volunteers, and the weekend after Cooper's return, dozens of people came to the park area to help. However, even with their help, no new tracks appeared. One of the most mysterious details that the rangers recorded concerned the condition of the collar. It had a fresh knot on it, not tightened the way Darcy did. This was not noticed immediately, but only after a veterinarian examined it. The report reads, "The knot is not standard, tighter than the owners usually tie." This was another disturbing hint that Cooper might have been with someone the family didn't know recently. Despite the renewed search, despite the hope, despite the public attention, no concrete traces were found. The forest remained empty, unanswered, and silent. Cooper was the only one to return from it, but he could not tell what had happened to him, where he had been, or who he had seen during those long 8 months. He could only lie at the doorstep of the motel, eyes closed from exhaustion, leaving behind an endless list of new questions. After Cooper's return, private investigator Victor Grant decided that the dog was not just an emotional symbol for the family, but the only real carrier of information about what had happened in the depths of Yosemite. In his official report, he noted, "The dog is the only entity that has had physical contact with the forest during the entire period of disappearance." This meant that any change in Cooper's behavior could indicate something important. In coordination with the rangers, Grant took Cooper with a dog handler and walked the full route from the motel toward the forest. They moved slowly, leaving enough space for the dog to choose his own direction. At the beginning, Cooper acted chaotically. He jerked excitedly from side to side, sniffed the ground, but did not attempt to walk purposefully. This behavior is typical for an animal that has been under stress for a long time. However, after about a few miles, the situation changed dramatically. According to the dog handler, recorded in the official materials, Cooper lost his chaotic nature and behaved as if he remembered a certain smell or place. He took off running and confidently ran deep into the forest belt between the small settlements of El Portal and Foresta. The terrain there is difficult, dense thickets of pine and juniper, chaotic piles of stones, and the remains of old service roads. That's why this area was never in the top priorities of the official search. The dog led them to a building that even experienced rangers remembered only from old inventory maps. It was the technical hangar of a geological exploration company that had been conducting research in the area several decades ago. The gray metal building seemed about to collapse. Some of the walls had been pierced by a storm, the roof was sagging. But there was a lock on the broken gate that was completely out of keeping with the overall appearance of the building, new, shiny, and without any traces of corrosion. Grant's report stated that this contrast raised reasonable suspicion as to the recent use of the facility. They carefully opened the gate. Inside, silence reigned, broken only by the distant sound of the wind seeping through the leaking panels. An inspection of the hangar showed that despite its dilapidated appearance, someone had been inside recently. Rusty metal boxes, old maps of geological sections, and pieces of abandoned equipment were lying in the corners. None of this had any value, as it had been there since the company's days. But among this mess, there were objects that could not have belonged to that era. There were empty cans on the concrete floor, not yet covered with dust. Nearby was a sleeping bag, neatly rolled up and clamped with a strap. Only those who planned to use it again fold it like that. The dog handler's documents contain a phrase, "The tracks are no older than a few weeks." This meant that someone had lived here quite recently. The most important discovery was not a sleeping bag or even canned food, but a small object lying in the far corner between the burnt papers. It was a children's ball, rubber with scratches, worn on one side. According to Michael Joseph, who later identified the object, it was the ball that Zach and Darcy often played with Cooper in the backyard of their Fresno home. It was not just another toy. It was bought for Cooper several years ago, and the dog always recognized it. He recognized it this time too. He immediately ran over, sniffed it, and started whining. This fact confused Grant the most. The ball was used, which meant that someone had taken it from the family's belongings after they disappeared. It was no accident that the ball was in the hangar. It was evidence of the presence of someone who had access to Darcy and Zach's personal belongings. The detective noted a number of key circumstances. First, the hangar was officially listed as abandoned, but had a new lock. Second, there were traces of activity inside that belonged to someone who had been there recently. Third, an item directly related to the missing family was found far from the place of their last known route. Rangers assumed that the ball could have been brought in by animals. However, the condition of the toy denied this. It did not have the characteristic coyote or lynx tooth marks, and it had not been chewed on. Someone had put it in the shed on purpose. After the initial inspection, the area around the building was examined. Several fuzzy shoe prints were found on the soft soil near the back wall, too worn to identify the model or size, but distinct enough to understand that these were the steps of an adult, not a tourist. Hiking boots have a distinctive tread, but these footprints looked more like work shoes or boots with smoother soles. Not far away in the grass, we found a broken lace from a backpack. It was also recently torn, and the fibers had not yet darkened. It was not possible to determine whether the lace belonged to Darcy's or Zach's backpack, but the coincidence was too suspicious. Meanwhile, Cooper was not calming down. He approached the side wall of the hangar several times, trying to sniff the gap between the panels, whining and looking at the people as if waiting for them to react. His anxious behavior was clearly related to this place. In the evening of the same day, Grant submitted a formal request for a full forensic examination of the hangar. His report includes the phrase, "This is the first material connection to the Joseph family since the disappearance." It was this discovery that signaled the investigation to reconsider its search map, and, for the first time in many months, to believe that there might be an answer under the layer of silence in the forest. The discovery of the children's toy was only the first layer of what the old Sierra Survey Corp building was hiding. The very next morning, Detective Victor Grant returned there with sheriff's officers and technicians from the county crime lab. They worked methodically according to procedure. Every square foot of the hangar was photographed, labeled, and checked for signs of human presence after the company officially shut down. The dust that covered the equipment and old vehicle bodies had been untouched for many years, but next to the personal belongings that had been found earlier, clearer lines were traced, traces of hands or the movement of objects. While sorting through stacks of old documents, one of the technicians came across a tourist map. It was worn, the edges were wet in places, but the route of the Deer Camp Trail was still clearly visible. On it, someone had drawn a thin, almost invisible path with a rough graphite pencil that led far off to the side in the direction of the old Hennis Ridge gravel pit. According to official maps, it was not marked as a ridge or auxiliary trail. It could only be seen on local maps that were not given to tourists. That is why this area was not checked during the initial search. The map was the first direct evidence that someone had deliberately explored an area far from the main routes. There were several faint lines on the back of the sheet, as if someone had drawn a plan, but then erased it. Under a magnifying glass, forensic experts could only read the outlines of letters that did not form complete words. The internal report states that the traces of the inscriptions have no obvious connection to topographical markings. At the opposite end of the hangar, the technicians discovered what would later be called an informal residence. Under an old table was a thin mattress covered with a sleeping bag. Next to it was an empty metal mug, a decommissioned industrial lantern, and 2 cans of canned food, one of which could still be opened without difficulty. The cans were of modern production, meaning that the person who lived here did not come here 10 years ago. They showed fresh footprints. A small spot of wax was found on the concrete between the technical boxes. This could mean that candles were used, although there were remnants of old electrical wiring in the building. This detail reinforced the suspicion that whoever was here avoided light sources that could be seen from a distance. The sheriff's report contains another interesting entry. Footprints at the entrance and under the walls indicate repeated movement of one person. The footsteps are uneven, similar to the movement of a person wearing heavy shoes and habitually dragging their feet. This confirmed the words of local residents who mentioned that a middle-aged man was sometimes seen in the area, always at a distance, hunting or fishing. None of them could describe him accurately. All the testimonies were vague, boiling down to the fact that he kept to himself and never spoke. The most mysterious detail was the fact that the hangar belonged to a company that had officially ceased operations many years ago. However, the lock on the gate was new. Forensic experts determined that it had been installed no earlier than a few months before the discovery. This was an important signal. Someone had deliberately kept access to the building and used it as a hiding place. Another noteworthy finding was that in one of the boxes under a pile of old geological reports, they found a partially crumpled piece of electrical tape that could have been used to fix or cover small objects. The adhesive-based substance was not completely dry. This meant that the use was recent. The dilemma then arose. Was this unknown occupant connected to Darcy and Zach's disappearance, or had he simply come across their belongings in the woods and moved them here? Grant insisted that the map was the key evidence of foul play. In his opinion, the person who used the map could not have been a random homeless person. She knew about the existence of the trail, which very few people used before the region was officially closed to tourists. Most locals and even some rangers did not have an accurate idea about it. After discovering the map, it was decided to head in the direction indicated. The route ran through difficult terrain, dense thickets, areas with landslides, narrow depressions where even experienced rescuers moved slowly. According to old reports, the Hennis Ridge gravel pit was a large but abandoned gravel pit. Work there had stopped long before the Josephs disappeared from the park. In the documents of the companies that worked in the area, the pit was mentioned as a place with difficult terrain and frequent micro-landslides. That is why the entrance to the quarry was always surrounded by warning signs. The group that headed toward the quarry included Grant, 2 sheriff's officers, and a technician who was familiar with the area. They moved slowly, carefully examining every rock, every hollow. Most of the way, they had to walk without paths, relying on the compass and old map markings. According to the technician who wrote in the report, the path marked on the map existed, but it was erased by time and almost invisible, even from a close distance. It was this fact that aroused the greatest interest. If an unknown person used such a trail, he must have known the forest well. This excluded a tourist or a random person. Someone had arranged a hiding place in an inaccessible place and was using routes that had long since fallen out of the official maps. It was obvious. The path that started in the hangar led to the darker part of the forest, where the probability of finding the answer grew, along with the fear of what that answer might mean. The Hennis Ridge gravel pit was a place rarely mentioned, even by those who grew up in these woods. Old mapping schemes only showed it as a technical facility that had been abandoned in the 90s. On the ground, it looked like a deep, shadowy dip in the middle of the thicket, partially flooded with opaque water and surrounded by tall mounds of sand and gravel. Local residents avoided the area. It was too easy to stumble and fall into the depths, where neither radio nor mobile network worked. The search team moved slowly, following protocols, inspecting the perimeter, marking dangerous areas, checking every hollow and every depression between the mounds. The air was silent, a characteristic of places that had not been touched by human footsteps for a long time. Cooper, who had been brought along, walked beside them on a long leash. According to the dog handler's report, the dog was tense, but not afraid. He reacted to odors that the team could not recognize. At first, it seemed to be the result of overstimulation, but after about an hour of examination, Cooper suddenly became alert, stood in a stance, and pulled in the direction of one of the mounds. There, under some low snags, he began digging so hard that the officers could barely hold him back. Detective Grant ordered him to expand the work area. The ground was loose, mixed with pieces of gravel. In a few minutes, the team found the first items, fragments of fabric similar to tent cloth. Then they found pieces of synthetic clothing, torn as if someone had deliberately tried to make them unrecognizable. The next camera to be found was a smashed camera with a broken body. Judging by the model, it could have been the camera used by Darcy and Zach. There were shards of plastic and glass on the ground around it, and thin strips of strap that had been cut or torn off. This was recorded in the forensic report. The items were hidden intentionally. The damage is not of a natural nature. This meant that someone was trying to get rid of the evidence. As soon as the team began to clear away the topsoil over a wider area, it became clear that they had stumbled upon a burial site. The soil was disturbed, mixed with sand, and underneath it was visible darker soil that is usually discarded during digging. The shallow pit, as it turned out later, had been dug in a hurry, without clear edges, with uneven depth. When it was uncovered completely, it became clear that this was not an accidental grave. The remains were lying side by side in a close position. According to a forensic expert who arrived at the scene, they were placed as if someone was trying to hide them as quickly as possible, without taking the time to create a deeper pit. Despite the state of destruction of the clothes, it was possible to identify the bodies as two people. Later, the identification was confirmed by personal belongings. In the pocket of Zach's outer layer of clothing was a small black wallet. It was miraculously preserved. The leather was damaged by water, but not completely destroyed. Inside were a few crumpled bills, Zach's driver's license in a name that left no doubt, and a credit card with some of the data still readable. It was the wallet that provided the decisive proof that the remains belonged to the Josephs. Next, the surveyors found a rusty crowbar next to the pit heavy, with a curved edge, partially covered with hardened soil. It was found under a layer of branches and debris, as if someone had deliberately buried it to hide it. The crowbar was sent for examination immediately on the spot. The forensic expert preliminarily determined that the nature of the damage to the bones was consistent with blows from a heavy blunt object. Different areas of the bones bore traces of multiple, severe blows at right and oblique angles, indicating a brutal attack. The preliminary forensic medical assessment recorded in the materials contains the phrase, "Death occurred as a result of multiple severe blows to the head and torso." This meant that the victims did not die in a fall or natural disaster. They were murdered. The bodies were hastily buried, but not too deeply, which contradicted the behavior of most criminals familiar with the area. This created an important detail. The person who buried them was either limited in time or did not have the tools to do it properly, or they were acting in a state of panic. All the traces around the pit were collected carefully: soil, tiny fragments of tissue, small stones with possible soldered particles of microscopic material. The investigators tried to find any genetic trace of an unauthorized person, but it was clear on the spot that some of the evidence had been lost due to the long-term effects of the weather. The sheriff's officers recorded another detail in their report. Two different groups of footprints were found near the burial site. One was probably a dog's, fast, chaotic, shallow. But the second ones were much more blurred, larger, with a characteristic weight. They indicated the movement of an adult who moved several times around the hiding place. The discovery of the body and belongings in this quarry led to an important conclusion. The perpetrator or perpetrators knew about and used the abandoned trail. They deliberately moved the bodies away from the trail and hid them in a place where few people walk. This required knowledge of the area or a long stay in the forest. The search, which had long been based on assumptions, received physical evidence for the first time. And this evidence showed that the disappearance of Darcy and Zach was neither an accident nor a root error. It was a deliberate, brutal attack, and someone in these woods knew how to make sure they were never found. Over the next 6 months after the discovery of the grave in the quarry, the investigation entered its most difficult phase. Detective Victor Grant worked according to the standards of large-scale criminal cases, systematically, without emotion, with full coverage of all possible versions. But day after day, he saw the same thing. Every trace that looked promising dissolved into nothing. The first to be checked were people with criminal records in the neighboring counties. The sheriff's report stated that 17 people were identified with convictions for theft, disorderly conduct, domestic violence, and illegal possession of weapons. None of them could have been in the Yosemite area in June 2014. Some had confirmed work records, some had witnesses to their stay in other cities, and one of the suspects was serving a short sentence in a local jail. The wording was recorded. The physical description and alibi do not match any details of the case. Next, Grant turned his attention to Sierra Survey Corp. Although the company had officially ceased operations long before the events, its hangar became a central node in the story. The former director, who lived in Sacramento, provided a full package of financial and technical documentation. The reports confirmed that the facilities had been mothballed, the equipment written off, and the staff dismissed. There were no signs of illegal activity, no shadow contractors. There were no people inside the organization who could have had any connection with the Josephs' hidden belongings. The official report states, "No traces of abuse were found. The premises could have been used by unauthorized persons without the company's knowledge." The detectives then proceeded to analyze the surveillance cameras. Within a radius of about 50 miles of the quarry, there are dozens of gas stations, roadside shops, camping centers, and parks. Grant reached out to everyone, officially and through personal contacts. Hundreds of hours of video were received. The report states that thousands of hours of footage were reviewed. The result was the same. No unidentified vehicle near the quarry during the period of the disappearance, no suspicious figure, no activity that was even slightly out of the norm. They were especially hopeful about the forensic examination. The crowbar, the most obvious tool of the crime, could contain traces of whoever used it. But the metal was covered with a thick layer of corrosion. The laboratory recorded the complete destruction of potential prints. The analysis of microparticles showed only mixed traces of soil and sediment typical of the quarry area. Nothing unique. Soil samples from the burial site also did not add clarity. All traces of DNA found belonged to officials, rescuers, and the victims themselves. Not a single foreign cell, not a single hair, not a single fragment that could point to an attacker. At this point, there was only one hypothesis left that was officially considered unlikely: an attack by an unregistered person, a traveler, seasonal worker, homeless person, or undocumented person. Such an attacker could be completely absent from the databases, have no transportation, and leave no digital traces. But the case file highlights a phrase that casts doubt on this version. The way the bodies were hidden indicates a good knowledge of the area and confidence in their actions. There was no chaos in the attack. It had a rational logic that is rarely followed by casual travelers. There is another important note in the forensic reports. There were no items left at the grave that criminals usually lose: cigarette butts, pieces of rope, small debris, food remains. The place looked as if it had been thoroughly cleaned. This again pointed to a cautious attacker. Separate checks were made on people who might be nomadic in the vicinity of the park, staying in temporary shelters or engaged in illegal fishing. However, these checks were inconclusive. Even those who could have been suspected fell through the cracks due to coincidences of time and routes. Grant increasingly used the phrase "closed circuit" in his notes. In his estimation, the person involved in the murder could have lived far beyond the search area or had already left it long before the hangar was discovered. If it was a local, he was hiding as if it was not the first time he had done it. By the end of 2015, the case had lost signs of momentum. The archives were filled with dozens of protocols, but none of them led the investigation further. The official document of the prosecutor's office contained the phrase, "suspended due to lack of new evidence." This meant that the investigation was not closed, but active work was suspended. Only the hotline was left for the public. Any anonymous information could be a chance. But among the hundreds of calls, most turned out to be false. People reported random hikers they had seen somewhere in the forest or described suspicious strangers who turned out to be ordinary tourists. In the end, the investigation was left with the same problem it faced at the very beginning. The forest remained silent. No one heard anything. No one saw anything. No one came out of the shadows to break the silence. And the longer the time dragged on, the clearer it became that whoever was behind Darcy and Zach's deaths knew how to disappear as well as how to attack. As the years passed, the case of the murder of Darcy and Zach Joseph gradually moved into what the Sheriff's Department calls a dead file. Cases that are not closed, but also not moving forward. Cases in which each protocol has been read hundreds of times, but the conclusions remain the same. All the documents from the first report of the disappearance to the forensic reports on the remains found now lay in the bottom section of the archive cabinet, marked with the sad phrase, "suspended." The investigation was not officially closed. All murders related to the territory of national parks formally remain open. But already in the first year after the discovery of the grave, it became clear that without a new witness, a chance discovery, or someone's anonymous confession, the case would not move forward. And no such events occurred. The hotline phone was silent except for the occasional false message that turned out to be nothing more than guesswork or confusing rumors. Meanwhile, Michael Joseph tried to get back to life, but the word no longer had the same meaning for him. According to his friends, he walked around the world as if a part of him was still in the woods. The bodies of his wife and son were returned to him, but this gave him neither answers nor peace. Only silence. The same silence that enveloped the Hennis Ridge gravel pit when the graves were found. He picked Cooper up from the veterinary clinic the same day the formalities were completed. The dog was exhausted, but alive, the only one who saw the family's last days. In the early months, Cooper waited at the front door every morning as if he expected Darcy or Zach to open it and call him out for a walk. Michael told his friends that the dog knows more than he can show, but even that hope disappeared over time. Gradually, Cooper stopped waiting, got used to the new routine, regained his weight, and started walking in the yard again, although sometimes he would stop and stare into the void longer than other dogs do. Michael often looked through Darcy and Zach's personal belongings that were returned after the forensic examinations. Camera fragments, a torn notebook, a partially preserved map found in the hangar. The reports listed these items as incidental, but to him, they were the last threads connecting the family to their past lives. He kept them in a box in the attic, not to hide them, but to avoid seeing them every morning because it was unbearable. Every year on the day of his disappearance, Michael came to Yosemite. It was not recorded in the documents, but many park employees knew about his arrival. He would arrive quietly, leave his car in the same parking lot where his family's Ford Explorer had last been parked, and walk several hundred yards into the trail. He did not try to walk the entire route. He only placed flowers at the information booth, touched the cold metal side, as if asking something of the place that had taken his loved ones. Some rangers recalled that he never asked for an update on the investigation. He never asked for new leads. He never made accusations. He just came and stood for a few minutes in complete silence, looking at the pine trees and rocks that stood as still as they had on the day of the tragedy. Darcy and Zach's story became a local legend. It was told to new park employees and recalled by volunteers who participated in the search. For some, it was a warning, a reminder that even experienced tourists can disappear without a trace. For others, it was yet another proof that the majestic American forests sometimes hide darkness that you won't see on tourist postcards. Some newspapers describe the tragedy as an example of a perfect crime, but Michael never agreed with this formulation. He did not believe in perfection. For him, it was just evil simple, cruel, and at the same time, invisible. And he knew that the person who took his family was somewhere. He lives and breathes somewhere, and even if no one else is looking for him, he exists. This thought has always accompanied him. At work, while traveling, at home, when he sat in his chair and stroked Cooper's head. She was there at night and during the days of remembrance, not as hope, not as fear, as a reality that he could not come to terms with. The forest returned the dog to him, but it did not return the answer. And almost every year, on the same date, Michael stood at the beginning of the deer camp trail, looked at the green shadow over the mountain range, and thought the same thing. Someone out there knew the truth. Someone out there had walked those same trails. Someone there made a choice that destroyed their life. And that someone still lives in this big world, without a name, without a face, without punishment.